love the picture there. Yep, everything's going good. It looks like stuff's transferring okay.
Okay.
I'm just going to stick one more thing up here. And wow, that's an interesting virtual scene. That looks like right near the church.
Actually, it's in the McDowell Mountains
Okay.
at about 2,800 to 3,000 feet elevation.
Wow. Okay.
I did that hike in July at about 105 degrees. 10 miles.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yay. Okay.
It wasn't 40 days in the desert, but it was a long day.
I'm going to go ahead and open in the browser instead of the usual way. Something logged me out that shouldn't have. So I'm just going ahead and putting the dashboard back up. I don't know why this decided to do this. Always an adventure, you know, always an
Yep.
adventure. Just about the time I think I have it all figured out. There we go. That should work. Yeah. And that should work. There we go. All right, I'm hoping everything is in order. Everything is online. Good. Chat decided to go ahead. We're going to get started.
Are there other people online?
Well, Pastor Brian told me that we were supposed to have possibly a guest who had come to the third service.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was kind of hoping we would, but he didn't say absolutely.
We may yet.
We may yet. People tend to run a little late.
Right.
So I wouldn't be surprised if that didn't happen. There we go. And so that's good. And then there are always the other folks that can join us when we're on. It's just kind of a funny thing to have the chat in the browser instead of its normal location. So there we go. But we'll just go with it. I'm going to do one other thing. I'm going to hit this so that it's actually recording, and that way I have it for later anyway, which I think is good. We're in Leviticus 16, by the way. So, all right. See, we got a few folks trickling in here, but I love it. I absolutely love it. So if you have your Bibles, you want to be in Leviticus 16. I'm going to go to the PowerPoint shortly here, and the PowerPoint will show share screen PowerPoint, share. There we go. And the PowerPoint should be visible. And I'm going to go ahead and move me and you down so that the PowerPoint is visible, but we are not. And we're going to get started. We're continuing related to the Day of Atonement and the regulations there, which are absolutely very important to understand atonement from the perspective of what God gave Israel and what we have in Jesus. So we're going to be spending our time there. Again, there's a lot of procedure. We'll talk about how that relates to us. Obviously, we don't follow the same procedure anymore, but that doesn't mean the principles aren't important and some of the stuff there is not important. As always, as suggested to me by one of our Sunday school folks, we have last week's take-home truth and this week's, and they will fit together very nicely. Not that they don't usually, but this week, I guarantee you there'll be a nice little fit here. Last week, we looked at Jesus as our high priest who provides the way of atonement for us before God the Father. Now, you'll see a corresponding take-home truth at the end of this, and we'll look at some practical applications. You'll see my little virtual, what are they called? Artificial intelligent pedagogic assistant. I've enjoyed this. This is a little add-on to PowerPoint. And so I like that. He's pointing out that the proper uniform is a must. And you'll see that he's wearing his proper police uniform here with his cup of coffee. And we're going to look at verses 3 and 4 as we get started here. We started talking about this just in terms of the background. Now we're going to start looking at the general procedure. The first thing that's listed is the uniform. Aaron shall come into the holy place with the blood of a young bull as a sin offering, and a ram as a burnt offering. He shall put the holy linen tunic and the linen trousers on his body. He shall be girded with a linen sash, and with a linen turban he shall be attired. And these are the holy garments, which therefore he shall wash his body and put them on. And we've talked a lot about this whole idea of ritual cleanliness being connected to moral cleanliness. Now, a few things you need to understand about ancient worship. Pagan worship was sexual. I still remember Izzy, our tour guide in Israel, pointing out that what was the draw of pagan worship? Well, there were a few draws to pagan worship, but one of the draws to pagan worship was the sexual element. Pornography and paganism went together. And so the uniform includes a few things. The uniform was specified way back in Exodus, and we spent a lot of time with it. You have a tunic and you have trousers. Trousers are pants. Remember that there was a passing by and a passing up. As far as the tabernacle, the idea was that because of the time frame and the way men were dressed, there should be no exposure of those parts. And you'd think, well, God designed the male body and should have no problem with the way he designed it. The issue was that the worship of him should not be sexualized in an inappropriate manner. In other words, he did not want to be addressed or looked upon as the ancient gods. Now, in the ancient way of thinking of things, the act in the temple that was very physical and intimate represented the gods coming together with their consorts. So Baal had a consort, and when you went ahead and did things that we won't discuss here in the light, Baal and his consort united, and that produced rain and fertility and all the blessings of Baal. So the way it sort of worked here is sort of a sympathetic magic sort of thing, where you did certain things to manipulate the gods to get what you wanted. And of course, if they were mad at you, you got what you didn't want. And so the linen trousers are here probably for several reasons, but one of the reasons is a basic modesty issue and to connect those sorts of pagan practices. God wanted to make very clear his people understood that he was not like the false deities that weren't true deities at all, and he would not be worshiped the way they were, and their thinking about him needs to be different than the pagans around them. And so you need to kind of get that feeling there. God was a God of holiness and ethical purity, and he did not want to be considered as Baal and the other deities. And so there is some outfitting there that is essentially pants. And that's there for some reasons. But don't miss that. God is making his and regulating his worship distinctly different than the pagans around Israel. So they were to be separate in the way they lived, and they were to be separate in the way they worshiped. We're going to talk a little more about outfitting in just a few minutes, but basically our worship, we need to be careful not to adopt negative aspects of the world's way of doing things in our Christian worship. And it's all too easy to practice synchronism. So the uniform is a definite part of things. Before he did anything, he had to dress in the official uniform. Now, this uniform pointed out his function, it honored God's holiness, and it set him apart so that anyone who saw him in these garments or knew he was putting them on knew that Aaron was set aside and different from the get-go. And so this was a reminder to the children of Israel when they saw these outfits that Aaron was carrying on his official function. He was not just Aaron at that moment. He was Aaron the high priest. He was Aaron Hagadal, Kohen Hagadal, the high priest. He was functioning in a particular office and a particular way. Now, we no longer necessarily do this. The high church still has clerical garments. The Catholic High Church did this for specific reasons. They borrowed the forms of the Old Testament and synchronized them in an inappropriate way. I believe this is due to replacement theology. They thought that the church was Israel, and so they had to have corresponding garments. The Anglican Church and others borrowed the idea of special garb, although they rejected the sacramentalism. I think nowadays we're used to seeing our clergy wear exactly what we wear. Now that's good in a sense, but it can lead to just considering our individuals called to be shepherds, just like one of us, one of the gang, in a sense. Does that make sense? And we can fail to have the proper respect for called men. It doesn't mean the pastor is holier or better than everyone else. He has a particular function, and we could begin to ignore that function and begin to ignore that function comes with some responsibilities, and it comes with a level of respect that is sort of due. And so Hebrews 13 talks about us honoring those who are given oversight of our souls. And so there's a balance there. Now, how could this be abused? Well, where this gets abused in the evangelical church is real simple. The Bible doesn't address what a pastor has to wear. Okay? And one of the dangers is we can get legalistic over the form of dress. So we want to come up with a balance here. We want to honor the principle that we're to worship rightly, but we also want to honor the principle that there is a freedom that we have in Messiah, in Jesus, that the children of Israel did not enjoy. Aaron could not enjoy the freedom to wear whatever he wanted. He could not go in his bathrobe, so to speak, and visit and worship God. So there's a balance here that we want to keep. But there is nothing in the Bible that specifies a pastor's dress. There's no official dress for a pastor anywhere in the New Testament that I can find. There is no exact dress code for believers in terms of the worship service. Now, we're going to find balance because I think there are principles here. But I want to be careful. And I'm going to tell you a story about one church that went a little too far with this. The church's name is protected. Okay, kind of like Dragnet, only I'm protecting the guilty. And they went a little too far. I was invited once to a conference that Dr. Whitcomb was at and Reginald Showers was at. I had a wonderful time at the conference, sitting down talking with Dr. John C. Whitcomb and Reginald Showers. This particular church had a sign on the door. I will never forget the sign on the door. Now, I don't going to give you the exact wording, but essentially it was like this. If one does not have a suit and tie, one did not need to bother coming to the service at all. It was suggested that if an individual did not own one, he should see the church deacon so that the church can properly outfit him for the service, lest he be unfit to be in the presence of God. In other words, what this church said is, if you don't have proper attire, don't come. And if you're too poor that you don't have a suit, then you will talk to our deacons and we will charitably provide you a suit so that you can enter God's presence with the appropriate dress that makes you acceptable before him. This is legalism at its worst. Now, why do I say that? Well, I don't say that to insult this church. I deliberately withheld the name because in doctrine, they were very sound in a lot of ways. But in practice, they had fallen subject to or victim to what I would consider to be legalism. First, it sends the wrong message to people. That sign may end up sending the message that is contrary to God's nature and the inclusivity of the gospel. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean you get to heaven anyway. I mean the gospel is open to every person. Okay, the church proclaims the gospel, and anyone who is willing to respond to that gospel is welcome to the kingdom of God, regardless of socioeconomic class, background, ethnicity. Any of that is irrelevant to the gospel. Okay. One, this would indicate that God is more concerned about someone's outward clothes than he is their inward person as far as hearing the gospel. Now, remember, this is not addressed to believers who are coming. This is addressed to some guy who's just getting to the door of the church, and he may not be a believer. And now he turns around and goes home and never hears the gospel because he didn't have a suit. Okay. That is highly inappropriate to me. To expect that an unsaved man who is feeling a little draw of the Spirit is going to actually pull the deacons aside and explain to them why he doesn't have a suit before he's regenerate puts the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And it creates a barrier to the gospel that Jesus never intended and God's nature doesn't require. Aaron was functioning as a high priest under a particular system that Israel was given related to atonement. This was not intended to be a law for the church in relation to the dress of believers coming into God's presence. Jesus never ever required a change of outfit when he was ministering to people. When he saw the woman at the well, who, by the way, did not have a sparkling lifestyle, I know that because Jesus in John says, "You have had several husbands, and the man you're with now is not your husband," which indicates that she probably did not have a career as a nuclear scientist. He did not require her to change her clothes. When he dealt with the lepers who were suffering from leprosy, and by the way, their clothing would be pretty shabby because they couldn't get near people, so they weren't doing a thing like going to the men's clothing outlet regularly. He did not require a change in clothes. The other thing it does is shame somebody. Somebody could be poor and still have a desire to be respectable, and does not want to be embarrassed by the requirement that he goes ahead and proclaims his poverty to a bunch of strangers in order to get the right outfitting. Okay. So this is not loving your neighbor because it produces a level of shame that is not connected to moral issues, but maybe more connected to socioeconomic issues. It also creates an exclusivity that is not related to the willingness to accept the gospel, but is related to external factors. So that is the wrong way to approach this passage. And I've seen believers approach it that way. Now, is there a balance the other way? What you're going to see is that truth is balanced. What you have to be aware of in theology and in practice are the extremes. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't solid doctrines like the Trinity, but even in the Trinity, there's a balance. God is one, and yet he's three. And if I get out of balance on either side, I end up either with Unitarianism or tritheism. So you want to find the checks and balances. Truths are touched on by other truths. Think of it as a jigsaw puzzle. The piece that you're putting in has other pieces around it that determine its shape. Doctrine has shape as well as weight. And so let's talk about this, okay? God should be respected. I'm not telling people what to wear, but you don't want an attitude that says, hi, I have arrived, and God has to accept whatever I throw at him this Sunday. And the way I'm going to portray that is by portraying my total autonomy in what I wear. So when you're wearing it, you need to ask, who are you dressing for? Dr. Glazer was terribly strict with us missionaries. He said he wouldn't go to a doctor without a white coat, and he expected his missionaries to dress appropriately at meetings that they were speaking. And he told us what that was, and he drilled that into our heads. Now, I'm not actually in that sort of garb. I am missing the tie that Dr. Glazer would expect. But he expected certain things of us. And so the question one must ask is not whether one has a suit, but who are you dressing for? If you're dressing for God and to please him, then there's a level of respect that would naturally follow from following that basic principle. Now, to be scary and frightening, I have heard Christians make comments like, I do not need to dress modesty because individuals should not be looking. I patently am going to personally disavow that position. I'm going to say that modesty is true for guys as well as gals. Uh, Sometimes in Christian circles, it is assumed that only women should be modest and men should be gross in their conduct of how they dress themselves. I'm going to make the argument that immodesty can actually relate to both genders. Now, I can't speak from experience because I've never been a gal. I am not a gal. I was created male. But I hear tell from sound and godly women that they too can be distracted by what the other gender wears. So if your dress will produce titillation of the senses in a way that distracts from worship of the one true God, it's inappropriate. See the principle there? I'm not telling you exactly what to wear. What I'm telling you is what the principle is, and then the Holy Spirit, using the word and the principles, will give you the instruction that you need, which is the way New Testament spirituality sort of works. Message to young ladies: I do not for 1 minute buy the argument of feminism that men are pigs for being interested in what women look like. And so they are not to be affected by the female form. They're not to be tempted. They're not to lust. But let's just face it like this: if gals looked like guys, guys wouldn't be attracted to gals. Okay, that's just basic. In under normal circumstances, I realize now that we've got over 16 different genders and nobody knows what they are anymore in our society. But the way it's supposed to be designed is that man is actually supposed to be attracted to women. Now, how do I know that? From Genesis. When Eve came to Adam, he didn't say, wow, you know, she looks just like me. He said, wow. And that wow was that she was pleasing to him visually. And that is part of the design. So, yes, guys are supposed to avert their eyes. They're supposed to be gentlemen. But women, you're not supposed to be the biggest temptation in the world. We don't need a church full of Delilahs seeing how far they can push it. It's inappropriate. No, a man is not responsible to need a blindfold when he looks at you at a worship service. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. Okay. You don't want to show to a guy at a worship service any more than you think God appropriately would want him to see. Gentlemen, your sartorial splendor is not the main attraction at the worship service. Therefore, don't make it so. Okay, this is practical. Aaron had a uniform. We don't have uniforms, but we have principles. We have principles that can still be applied even though we have a uniform. We don't need a uniform per se, but we do need to be aware of ourselves and how we're coming across in terms of, are we enhancing the worship or are we distracting from God? And we don't want to be distractions. Now, there are further guidelines I, as a father, used, being that I have 3 daughters. They were very minimal. They are young, godly women, and they are more aware of these things than I never really had to sit down and have this talk. And so that's really great. But I do see things that are inappropriate. What type of message are you sending? Now, I want to be a little careful here. If the message of your clothing detracts from the message of the gospel, you're a walking mixed message. All right. And God is not the author of confusion. So don't help Satan create confusion. He doesn't need any help from you. What do I mean by that? Well, okay, the issue has to be place, and that has to be taken into account. Hillside has a brother who has a ministry to bikers. Now, if he's going to minister to bikers, when he's among bikers, he needs to be all things to all men that he might win the few. And so he is part of that culture, and he's bringing the gospel into that culture, and so he dresses appropriately when he's doing that. Okay, that is his garb because he is he is as a member entering into that culture and part of that culture, reaching that culture. And so I don't balk at him wearing cultural garb. All right. When I'm doing a Christ in the Passover, I will often wear cultural garb. I am relaying something from the scriptures. I am talking about a certain culture, and I want them to get a flavor for that culture, and I want to reach. And so I don't belittle that in any way. But let's say a young man came in with garb with a message that is so antithetically gospel related. Okay. I mean, a huge t-shirt saying, I hate Jesus at a morning worship service would be a contradiction. I am not really altogether sure that your average Budweiser shirt might be the best thing to wear at a morning service. That gets a little bit bordery. You know, you're going to have to weigh that. But pay attention to the message you're sending, not only in the modesty of your garb, but what's on your garb. So you want to be a little careful about that. Let God speak to you, but ask, what message is my clothes sending? Is it contradictory? Is it neutral? Is it reinforcing? There's nothing particularly Jesus about the color brown. There's nothing particularly Jesus about this dress shirt. Jesus's name isn't on the corner, but it certainly is not antithetical. There's nothing antithetical to a dress shirt. There's nothing antithetical to the color brown. And so that's a non-legalistic way of looking at this. And so I want to kind of bring that up and point out that, yes, there are principles that we can use. Love your pastor. Now, what I mean by that is your pastor is going to a youth event. Immediately after the service, they're all going to have to pile into a van and go to the youth event. Your pastor does not have time to change, or not much time to change. He's just finished preaching. He's got to grab a bite to eat. Maybe food is provided before the youth leave, and then he's got to hop on the bus with the youth. Don't make him play Superman by trying to find a phone booth to change into. Allow him to be in comfortable garb if he is immediately leaving for a youth event. Don't judge that. There are circumstances that may require it. He may indeed not want to wear his three-piece suit into the baptismal. It might shrink. There may be a case in which he has to dress less formally because he has several baptisms to do by God's grace. And so the suit might not be drip dry. Give a little bit of grace. Don't assume the worst, because the worst shouldn't necessarily be assumed. Now, if he's noted for coming in clothes that are absolutely horrendous, okay, it may be something's going on. It may be something else. But pay attention to what's going on and give a little bit of grace, and pay attention to the fact that you don't want to start with the assumption of guilt and judgment. Okay. Now, a summary is given prior to the details of the Yom Kippur service. So you're going to find those in verses 6 through 10. Aaron shall offer a bull as a sin offering, which is for himself, to make atonement for himself and his house. He shall take 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle meeting. Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat on which the Lord's lot fell and offer it as a sin offering, but the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented before the Lord to make atonement upon it, and then let go as the scapegoat into the wilderness. Now, this is very important. This is where we get the term scapegoat from. What we have is a summary here, and then the details will be repeated with more information. Now, Hebrew often does that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a summary headline, like a newspaper headline. Then the rest of the chapter gives the details. This is a very Hebraic way of doing things, where the summary or the headline's given, and then the details are further expanded upon in the following section. And that's what's going on here. Now, first of all, we need to be very clear. The sacrificial system, as uncomfortable as it is and as foreign as it is to us, is a system that God designed and intended for the children of Israel. Now, how do I know that? Well, Vayidaber Adonai et al Moshe. And the Lord spoke to Moses. This phrase appears 91 times and is associated with the giving of instruction and the implementing of commands that God, he intended for Israel. Sometimes when God wants to reveal or disciplines, it should not, you will see this phrase. It's used exclusively in the Pentateuch. So 91 times, it's exclusively in the Pentateuch, and it is almost it is used frequently to indicate the giving of instruction or the implementing of commands. And so the phrase itself and its usage gives us a clue that this is really something God intended. But it's not the final solution that God intended. It's a means to an end. It's a picture of something greater. Now, how do I know that? From Hebrews 9. Now, remember what I've always said. Hebrews is cued to Leviticus. You can't study the book of Hebrews without studying the book of Leviticus. If someone is doing that and they're not going back to Hebrews at all, they should consider doing that. If someone's teaching Hebrews, they had better go back to Leviticus because those two cross-reference to each other. And so it's terribly important that they go ahead and they do this. And so that's why that's there. Excellent. Radical Love is here. And I didn't see her in the chat on my chat thing, but I am thrilled that she is there. So hi to Radical Love. And sorry, I didn't see you sooner. I've had a little trouble with my chat today, but I'm glad you're here. We're going to keep going. Thank you for the likes. Thank you for the concurrent viewers. And we're going to just keep moving right along here. Let me look at Hebrews 9, 7 through 10. Now notice that the first part of this is Aaron giving a sin offering for himself and his household. This is very important. Before he could go in and make any sort of atonement for Israel, atonement had to be made for him. But into the second part, the high priest went once a year, not without blood. He offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all, we call that the Holy of Holies, by the way, had not yet been made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. Notice we're during the tabernacle period, although the writer of Hebrews is seeing the temple as a extension of the tabernacle. It was symbolic for the present time, okay, in which both gifts and sacrifices were offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect. You can understand that word perfect in the Greek as complete, okay, in regard to the conscience concerning only with food and drinks and various washings and fleshly ordinances until the time of what? Reformation. And so this is a temporary thing. It was a system that God intended, but it wasn't the ultimate answer to anything. And so we have to be aware of that too. This isn't God's ultimate answer, but it is his intended system. Okay. In fact, we need to understand why isn't it his perfected system. By the way, this is why I don't believe we're still under the Torah in the sense of the church having to keep all the forms of Israel, like certain groups like the Black Hebrew Israelites do, because where's their sacrifices? You can't separate out too neatly one from the other. They're sort of connected in a way, okay? The problem is endless repetition is one of the problems you face with this system. For the law having a mere shadow of things to come and not the image of things can never with the same sacrifices, which they offered continually year by year, remember this is a yearly thing, make those who approach perfect or complete in God's sight, for then they would have ceased to be offered. Now, understand the argument that the writer of Hebrews is making. If these things could perfectly fulfill God's purpose, they would not need to be repeated consistently. All right? By the way, this is very important in understanding Catholic theology. The Mass is a re-crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Because really, Catholic theology teaches, and I've talked to Catholics, that Jesus' sacrifice makes one able to be saved, but does not completely and utterly save anybody. That's why you can lose things. You have to keep doing the ordinances. You have to keep going to Mass. You have to keep doing these works because Jesus' sacrifice is not sufficient to save you from your sins ultimately and completely. Now, Hebrews, which talks to the Jewish person, also speaks to the Catholic. Why do you have to keep doing Mass if one Mass was sufficient in order to make you right before God? The fact that you have to keep going to it or doing it means that it didn't effectually, perfectly do what it needed to do. For the worshipers, once purified, look at this, continuing, would have no more consciousness of sins. Now, it doesn't mean they wouldn't be conscious when they sinned. It means they would be conscious of God's divine forgiveness. But in those sacrifices, there's a reminder of sins year to year. It is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. So the writer of Hebrews is saying, first of all, it's only a shadow of better things to come because the sacrificial system doesn't ultimately and perfectly deal with the problem. And how do we know that? Because it had to keep being done. Therefore, 7:11, if perfection came through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law. Notice that he's going to make a connection between the priest and the law. What further need was there of another priest who should be according to the order of Melchizedek and not called according to the order of Aaron? So what's very clear here is these are good regulations that God set up, but they aren't the ultimate system or solution that God intended. And if you replace that with a crucifix and a guy changing bread to Jesus's physical body, which is way too Platonic and Platonistic for me, then you haven't accomplished anything because you have the same problem. So your Catholic person, and I remember doing something on Catholicism, needs very much to understand that Jesus's death takes care of sins once and for all. Okay? That's why I like to say once saved, completely saved. Which part of Jesus's death was not good enough to accomplish the task is the real question. Scapegoat. We need to talk about the scapegoat. That's 10. The goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement and to let it go as the scapegoat into the wilderness. In other words, two goats, one dies, the other is released. Okay. You need to understand that not only does sin need to be paid for, but it needs to be removed. Now, again, I keep going back to because our old hymns, you'd say what you want. I know the beat was great. But, again, I go back to Rock of Ages. Be of sin the double cure, safe from wrath, and make me pure. And what the writer of this hymn is trying to get across is that the work of God in saving sinners requires two things. It requires that the penalty be paid and the sin be removed. So we talk about propitiation and expiation as the way of understanding these two things. Now, the way James Freeman and Chadwick put it in Manners and Customs of the Bible is certainly this dramatic ritual in which people could vividly see their sins laid on the scapegoat and removed from among them was a foreshadow of Isaiah's later statement about Christ, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. Now, what he is saying is essentially that the scapegoat and the goat sacrificed symbolize two parts or two necessary elements in the atonement, both of which Christ fulfills. Now we go to the ritual in detail. Now I know this is difficult to see, so if you have your Bible, go to Leviticus 16:11 through 22. Daniel, if you're there, if you can unmute yourself and read that, that'd be a help to me. Is that possible? Maybe not.
It's
good.
possible, but I just closed my Bible. Tell me where to go again.
Okay. Leviticus 16:11 through 22.
Leviticus 16:11 through 22. And Aaron shall bring the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and shall make an atonement for himself and for his house, and shall kill the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself. And he shall take a censer full of burning coals of fire from off the altar before the Lord, and his hands full of sweet incense beaten small, and bring it within the veil. And he shall put the incense upon the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is upon the testimony, that he die not. And he shall take of the blood of the bullock and sprinkle it with his finger upon the mercy seat eastward, and before the mercy seat shall he sprinkle of the blood with his finger 7 times. Then shall he kill the goat of the sin offering, that is for the people, and bring his blood within the veil, and do with that blood as he did with the blood of the bullock, and sprinkle it upon the mercy seat and before the mercy seat. And he shall make an atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel, and because of their transgressions in all their sins. And so shall he do for the tabernacle of the congregation that remaineth among them in the midst of their uncleanness. And there shall be no man in the tabernacle of the congregation when he goeth in to make an atonement in the holy place until he come out. And he have made an atonement for himself and for his household and for all the congregation of Israel. So he's the only one in there. And then in verse 18, and he shall go out unto the altar that is before the Lord and make an atonement for it, and shall take of the blood of the bullock and of the blood of the goat, and put it upon the horns of the altar round about. And he shall sprinkle of the blood upon it with his finger 7 times, and cleanse it, and hallow it from the uncleanness of the children of Israel. And in verse 20, and when he hath made an end of reconciling the holy place, and the tabernacle of the congregation, and the altar, he shall bring the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat, and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel, and all their transgressions and all their sins, putting them upon the head of the goat, and shall send him away by the hand of a fit man into the wilderness. And the goat shall bear upon him all their iniquities, unto a land not inhabited. And he shall let go the goat in the wilderness.
Okay, thank you so much for reading that for me.
Sure.
Let's talk about this. Now, I want you to pay attention that you heard several ands. That is Anglicization, trying to translate what we call the Vav consecutive. This is a particular grammatical feature in Hebrew in a narrative to indicate progression or immediacy, that this came and then immediately that happened. And it's a main way of doing that. Your English translators often translate that and that's why the genealogy of Jesus sounds really weird. And so begot so, and you're going, what is going on with the English here? This is a use of the Vav consecutive. So the first and there indicates the first part of the ritual in detail. Then you have other things. Now my translation says then, but it's really another one of those Vav consecutives. And then you have an and he shall go to the altar that is before the Lord. And then you have an and when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place, the tabernacle of meetings. So you want to see those as consecutives, next. And that gives you the sequence of the procedure. The first thing that has to happen, and we've talked about, is Aaron has to deal with his own sin. And that's your first and we've talked about that. Okay. In greater detail, okay, the cloud of incense covers the mercy seat that is on the testimony lest he die. And he shall take some of the blood and sprinkle it on the mercy seat on the east side. Before the mercy seat, he shall sprinkle some of the blood 7 times. Now you might say, what's magic about 7? I don't know that anything's magic about 7, but I do know that Jews got used to counting in 7, and it began to get associated with the idea of completion because of the creation week. Remember that Jewish people learned by story the creation week was done in 7 days. You have 7 sprinklings. They would tend to think that this, as an act related to God, completed something. And that would be reasonable for them to possibly view this as, is to give the idea that this is a complete done thing. Incense is there because the Holy of Holies and that mercy seat will be blurred a little bit here, like London fog, by the incense. Thus, Aaron is not necessarily entering in before the atonement is made, staring at God full in the face. You don't enter God's presence full in the face with sin still upon you. And so the first step is atonement for himself. This is absolutely necessary because my wife is...
Yeah, I was going to have you finish your statement.
Okay.
Because?
Because a sinful person cannot enter into the holy presence of God. God's perfection is such that it excludes imperfection. The mere idea that we can approach God any other way but the way he is prescribed in Jesus Christ dishonors his glory. If an unsaved person wants to say, why does it have to be this way? Okay. One of the things we can say is that it is dishonoring to God to tell God his method isn't appropriate. Okay. Now they could say, I don't understand why God demands this. You could say, well, there are some reasons, but you need to understand something. The idea that you can bust into God's presence your way is inappropriate. Now I'm going to take a breath here real quickly to turn to my wife and find out what's going on. She could even peek her head in here. The camera is right there, darling. Hello. There she is. Radical Love is on. So Radical Love just saw you. And then Ramon is on. And of course, that's Daniel. You know Daniel.
I know Daniel, yes.
Okay.
I actually saw him at church this morning. But
how did you see him at church?
They were setting up for the
okay.
kids thing. 2 things. Rob got your message, but he's in Vermont. So it's spotty, so he'll be calling you when he gets back.
Rob Cover.
Yes.
Thank you.
2, I'm leaving.
Okay.
All right.
Yep. You're out of here?
Yep. Bye.
Okay. Then I will let you be out of here. Email me or text me if you need any info from me. Okay. My wife's off out and about with the kids. So there you go. So there is a sense in which we can say to people, look, God has the right to determine under what conditions you can enter his presence. That would be true for any monarch. How much more for the king of the universe? Oh, Radical Love says, God bless, dear. Radical Love says, God bless. So my wife says, thank you as she walks out the door into the great unknown. Okay. It is not God doesn't love people. It is not God doesn't care about people. It is not God is just trying to make life difficult and being nasty. It is that God's excellency demands a due respect. He is God and you are not. And he is excellent and you are less than. Okay, just to kind of be charitable about the thing. Now, we need a perfect high priest. Now, the problem with Aaron was, 1, he was not immortal, so he would die. The priesthood had to be passed on. We needed a high priest who could continue to intercede for us forever, who is without death, and Hebrews is going to talk about that. But we also need a perfect high priest. And Hebrews 7:27 and 28 hits upon that, who does not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sin first for his own sin, then for the people's sin. For this he did once for all when he offered himself up. For the law appoints as high priest men who have weaknesses, but the word of the oath, this is the oath that is being referred to in Psalm 110, The word of the oath, which came after the law, that's Psalms is after the law was given, appoints a son who has been perfected forever. And so Hebrews is pointing out that we need a perfect high priest. Aaron's first step was to make atonement for himself. Jesus has no such problem. Okay. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, which we're not going to get into, is the issue of the high priesthood continuing, which was affected by death. And we have more to deal with next week as we move on. And we're actually going to get into the sanctity of blood. And I will raise a few things I've had to do in terms of apologetics because of a rejection of blood atonement by certain Jewish polemicists. And so we'll get to that. But that's where we are. So this week, last week, we had Jesus as our high priest who can approach God for us. This week, we point out that unlike Aaron, Jesus is a perfect high priest. He's untainted by sin. Thus, he is able to offer a perfect sacrifice because he does not need to offer sacrifice for himself first and then for the people. And that's where we're at. So, questions, answers, conversation, favorite flavor of coffee? I don't know. Just giving
Just a comment. I always find it interesting the excruciating detail that God goes through to make sure that they understand the proper way to cleanse His house before the people come in, to make the people atoned for properly. It always amazes me the level of detail that He went through to provide that thousands of years ago, and even today in our workplaces and places where procedures are necessary, we find it a very difficult thing to do.
And remember, too, this is so totally different than the worship of the pagans around them because their gods were not ethical.
Yeah.
So God is going to great pains to point out his moral excellency.
Yeah.
In contrast to Baal, who is a crass deity who can be bribed or can be irritated and have a temper tantrum. By the way, this is something missing from Islam, which also downplays blood atonement, but I'll save that for next week. That says something about Allah. Okay, I put it this way when I did a recent broadcast or wanted to, refrigerator magnet saying, we believe in a God that's biddable, but not bribable.
No, that's good.
So that's the distinction. So
Yeah.
we'll get to it more next week, but I think there's a distinction between a biddable deity and a bribable deity. And Baal was bribable. So that's a refrigerator magnet saying, save that for next week.
Yeah.
And that'll set us up for getting into 17.
Good lesson today. Thank you.
My pleasure. And it was great having some of the folks from YouTube on too. I'm going to turn off the stop share there because we don't need to share the PowerPoint anymore. And then we'll get set. Thank you for being here. I'm hoping that the new person might end up joining us. And here we go. So next week, continuing adventures in Leviticus.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Have a
Take
good
care.
day.
Bye to everybody.
Bye.
Bye.